The Almost Perfect Podcast.
Welcome to the Almost Perfect Podcast, a celebration of fuck-ups, failures, and falling flat on your face. This is a podcast that believes you can learn from experience, but that experience doesn't have to be your own. Hi, I'm Bob Perfect, and I'm a functional fuck-up. Let's learn from somebody else's mistakes. And today we're learning from Charl Blignaut. Now, Charl is pretty hard to describe. He is he's one of the most important people, I think, in the South African media industry, in the South African cultural landscape. Just in general, Charl has had a very big impact over his many years on this planet, and is someone who I didn't really know that much about going into this conversation. I mean, I had ideas, I had understanding, I did do some research, clearly not enough, but I definitely, had an understanding of Charl's impact from the way other people talk about him, and also from my interactions with him. I've met him a few years ago at the Durban International Film Festival, and each time I've come into contact with him, I've always been enamored with him. I've always enjoyed listening to him speak. I always, just like in awe almost of just how he sees the world and how, strong his convictions are. And just, he's an absolutely amazing role model to so many different people. And he has such a great impact on so many different things. And we get into a bit of that in the conversation today. We get into the hows and whys of, what led him down this path. Charl was a conscientious objector back in the apartheid days when it came to being in the army, and from then on it's led him down, a life of politics and art and pop culture, and getting to write about Brenda Fassie and her coming out, and just being a part of such iconic moments throughout history. He's managed to tell a lot of great stories. He's been an important cultural voice, a critical voice as well, and he passes those skills on. He's very, very driven by his purpose to try and enable more journalists and more writers out there to be better, more artists in general. He's always got a critical viewpoint, and I really appreciate it and I really admire it. And you're going to, like I say, learn a hell of a lot in this conversation, just like I did. I actually feel like throughout this conversation, I was just 3 steps behind, man. Like, I wasn't able to necessarily keep up with what was actually being said. But thankfully, Charl is a fantastic storyteller and was able to share his story without too much interference from myself. So I greatly appreciate that, Charl. And I really do appreciate Charl sharing his time and stories with me, because he was about to head out, actually. He was flying back to Joburg, and I got that little bit of time just before he had to catch his flight. So thank you so much for your time, Charl, and thank you so much for your story. There are a lot of heavy topics that are going to come up in this podcast. So like stuff like sexual violence, stuff like just general violence, and just the realities of the world and of Charl's life do come up. So please bear that in mind as we do go forward with this. And I'm really stoked. I think quite a few people are going to listen to this one, just judging from how many people, know Charl and love Charl. And like I said, so many people, whenever I meet them, whenever I talk to them about Charl, have glowing things to say. I mean, I've just got this idea of who he is. I've never worked under him. I've never experienced a lot of the things that a lot of writers in South Africa that I encounter, do. And everyone is always just like, Charl is the absolute best. So you're going to get an understanding of why everyone feels that way, and why I'm just in awe of the man. And he's very humble, and he definitely wouldn't want me saying all these things about him. But you know what? This is my podcast, and I get to say whatever the fuck I want right now. Although I maybe should have spoken up a little bit more in the actual conversation, but I probably would have, detracted more from it Yeah, I don't know. I'm definitely talking myself down here, but it was just one of those things where it's like, damn man, you have lived such an impressive life and such a not just impressive life, such a laugh, a real laugh, one that's had its ups and its downs, like downs that I've never come close to experiencing. So yeah, I think a lot of us would have not experienced the things that Charl has, and I think some of you probably have as well. So it's either going to be relatable or you are going to be learning some new things from this conversation. And that's the point, of the Almost Perfect podcast. It's about finding the people who are like us, and also about finding the people who are different, who have different perspectives and who see the world differently to you. And yeah, Charl, I just think, sees the world in beautifully, but not even ideological terms. I was going to say ideological, but he's got a sense of duty and purpose, and at the same time, he's almost got like a forgiveness in his heart to other people who, are not as duty driven, I guess. But if you're someone who's actively, causing pain and destruction, then Charl will come after you, as many of our politicians, not that many, but a fair number of our politicians who have been siphoning funds into illicit places and places that money should not be going, taking it out of artists' pockets. That's stuff that Charl has covered very recently, actually, and also just in the past. So I think I've said enough about Charl Blignaut at the moment, and you're going to learn a lot more about him in just a few seconds. I did enjoy my time at working at the Durban Film Mart. I got to moderate a few different panels, and I've got one or two more interviews from the film mart, from Diff set up, hoping to get them done this week, but time hasn't been on my side, as you guys know. I do have the Heat City Comedy Festival coming up. It is coming up next week. That will be from the 30th of July to the 4th of August. I'm performing twice. I'm going to be hosting at Cool Runnings on the Friday, that's the 2nd of August, and then I'm doing my second ever one-man show, The End of the World. This is going to be on Sunday, the 4th of August at Seabrooks, and that's going to be at 8 p.m. Tickets are 60 Rand, web tickets, and 80 Rand at the door. And it's, like I say, like the show is what it says it's about. It's about the end of the world. I've been feeling a lot of that existential dread over the last year or so, and so I've decided to channel it into some comedy, and hopefully we can all laugh at our impending doom. Yay! Fun, light topics. And yeah, that's that. If you enjoy the podcast, you can find us on Facebook. That's the Almost Perfect Podcast, and we are almost_podcast on Twitter. I am on Instagram at Almost Perfect Bob. And if you really like the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/almost perfect, where you can subscribe a little bit more. Like, so like how you can subscribe just a little bit, like on iTunes or whatever. Like, that's like the base level subscription. That's the, hey, I just get this thing for free. But if you want to support the podcast and you really enjoy listening to these conversations that I have with some really impressive South Africans, then go on to the Patreon, and you can, like, basically you can give $1 or you can give $5, or I think $10. I can't remember, like $1 or $5. I'm super chilled with. I'm also chilled with you not giving me money. It's fine, but it does definitely help me do more of these. I'm hoping that this becomes, more of my thing as time goes on. I did chat at the comedy festival, not the comedy festival. Oh, see, having too many festivals in a row is messing with my brain. But at the film festival, there is potential to be doing some more podcasts. Not necessarily the Almost Perfect podcast, but something different. So I'm hoping, to keep these going and to get better at them. And if you enjoy them and you want to support them, you can do so at Patreon, and you might just get some extra goodies back. Like, I've given everyone there free tickets to my one-man show next week. And just in general, I'll be giving out different things as time goes on. So yeah, I think that's everything you need to know as we head into this conversation. Once again, thank you so much for listening. Here it comes. It's the Almost Perfect Podcast with Charl Blignaut. How you living, Charl? You're tired. You are looking like you are ready to go back to Joburg.
Yeah, but I'm always ready to go back to Joburg because really the cultural life of the country is there, and also Bay.
Also Bay, of course. So you're in Durban for the Durban International Film Festival and the Film Mart, and like this is where I first met you. This is where I first came into contact with you and found out who you were. But you've been in the art scene for your whole life, basically.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I didn't study because we were kind of not wealthy, despite our privileges of land and education. We were farmers, moved to Pretoria, where I went to the art school. But that was also mainly because everybody else expelled me from their school. Like, I was quite expelled.
So you've always been a little bit of a troublemaker.
Yeah. But I mean, if you're born into apartheid, what are you going to do? I mean, I was born into a very conservative farming community in Himansdorp. At a time where it was illegal to be queer, and I'm very queer. And
were you, like, just from a young age, did you know you were queer and that you didn't fit in with that society?
Yeah. I didn't have a moment. I think I came out to my parents when I was about 12. And, was met with a shambok. My father was a reborn Christian with a shambok. So there wasn't a lot of happiness at home. So yeah, I kept kicking against the systems. But what are you going to do if you're born into apartheid? What crystallized everything, obviously, for me was the army, being called up. I mean, from a young age, we were militarized at school, put into cadet programs. So for me, I came to the ANC and to the Black Sash and to liberation politics via my queerness. And it was that caused me to, I would refuse to raise flags and to march and to do things at school. And then they did come for me on my 21st birthday. And I fled to Joburg. Look, it wasn't that difficult for me because I was born in 1970, so by then the army thing was starting to die. There were too many conscientious objectors, and the court costs were becoming impossible for the army to defend.
So there actually were lots of people saying no.
By then there were the early conscientious objectors were imprisoned for long periods of time, or sent to the former homelands to teach. And of course, the queers in the army were given all sorts of aversion therapies. Yeah,
I've read some horrible stuff.
Yeah, so a lot of that was a conflation of things for me. It was my fear of the stories I'd heard. I had a boyfriend when I was at school who was quite a lot older than me. And he went to an army camp, and he sent me love letters in the back of the posters they made him make, which were of dead PAC and ANC operatives, with posters saying, Merry Christmas, PAC tourists, this is what we did to your comrades, this is what we'll do to you. Things like that, were made it impossible for me to be able to go to the army. And that determined my fate. I moved to Joburg, and I started waiting at Crackers. I worked as a rent boy because I wanted to. And I started waiting at a joint in Yeovil called Crackers. And I literally just inveigled my way into a newspaper. I had done some studying in Tunisia, some theoretical work around theory of literature. And I was very fond of theatre from my days at the art school, where I was writing plays and directing them.
Wow, I didn't know that about you. I thought you were always on the critic side of things.
No, I also had a TV production company. I've just written the Lebo Matosa drama series for BET with Portia Gumede. I do a lot of creative writing.
I've never read any of it. I don't know what your name's been attached to. I actually need to find more of your work. Then.
Yeah, but you're very young. Eh?
I am very young in comparison to... That's why I'm so glad I get to talk to you, because you're someone who's just had such a big impact on, art journalism in South Africa, and still to this day you do.
Yeah, it's a relative thing. I consider it my civic duty. I consider myself mandated to artists, and I think just because I'm doing my job doesn't mean I'm necessarily doing it well. I just think people are not doing the job.
So why do you have that sense of duty? Why do you love artists?
This thing that I'm telling you about growing up during apartheid, about being a conscientious objector, when the time came, I mean, I inveigled my way in at the Vrye Weekblad, and one of the first things, I basically just said to them, look, I'm here, I'm going to work for free until you pay me. And they eventually had to because I was giving them cover stories. At that time, I would track down Brenda Fassie and do a 12-page interview with her called In Bed with Brenda, where she comes out as a lesbian and brings her girlfriend into bed. I was literally 21 or 22. And this becomes a huge scandal in the Sunday papers where I now work. Brenda Fassie, lesbian. And one doesn't realize at the time the importance of these things, but Brenda Fassie is today our primary queer icon.
Yeah.
So the Vrye Weekblad, I mean, I was kind of put on tear gas duty occasionally, covering the marches, Kusatu, and look, this was, the early 90s, so the process of unbannings and the process towards democracy had begun, but the violence was everywhere. And I spent a lot of time at Luthuli House, then called Shell House, where I interviewed Peter Mokaba, and I interviewed some of the returning exiles, and I interviewed the future ANC leadership, often for Playboy magazine, who paid me better than anything I've been paid to this day. Like, they still pay better than the current rate.
I mean, yeah, Playboy has always had pretty good stories.
I don't know. It was fun. It was more the chance to meet this quite the generation of politicians.
And obviously, in South Africa, the editors weren't necessarily wanting those stories, were they?
I've never had an experience of that. I've never experienced an editor, or I was never willing to work for an editor that wasn't also a cultural person. I mean, an editor has to be an all-rounded person, has to be able to talk about sport, about business, about art, any of the sections in the newspaper. So, no, there was never any resistance. There was just white obliviousness, because, remember, we were still calling it Kwaito. There was this massive divide, and there's a documentary that was made, that was shown on Channel 4, Not a Bad Girl, where they actually recorded this interview I did with Brenda, and it's so clear in the interview how incredibly ignorant I am, how 100% dumb I am about black life. And so that journey, we were never expected to do the stories that mattered to the black majority in our little niche publications. But one of the people who was working at the Vrye Weekblad began a TV show, and this was in about 93, 92 even. And I went there to the SABC to start working on what was called artworks, that later became known as the Works, where Tim Mhlophe and Jerry Williams and I presented a show, and I did a lot of the interviews, and I started packaging inserts, and I started writing the scripts, and I started creating this cultural content where it was an incredible learning curve, where we were documenting the work that had been banned. I mean, there was the cultural boycott on the one hand, so we were not seeing the rest of the world's work, really. I remember Trevor Steele Taylor used to keep all the VHSs of all the banned films at the boot of his car, and he had like a banned film library. He was very strict. He wouldn't give you a new one until you returned the previous one.
But what were the consequences for doing stuff like that?
None. They went after the big... the art that was banned... they wouldn't ban a gallery show. They wouldn't ban a fashion show. They would ban the work once it became bumper stickers or T-shirts, or once it became mass distributed. Then they would get very, very tetchy about it. And they would confiscate the work and ban it. And the plays at the time, Matthew Krause and them had that experience where they did an incredible play where Bessie Verwoerd gives Verwoerd a blowjob on a train. And the state censors came to watch it. Bessie played by a man. And the state censors came to watch it and instructed them to go to Pretoria, and they had to act out the scene in front of the state censors, who would not come to the theatre. You would have to go to them. This was terribly awkward. I've asked Matthew over and over again to please write a book about this.
That is hilarious.
Yeah, so then the work was coming back, the exiles were returning, the big concerts were happening, and we could finally put onto TV the culture of the majority of South Africans. And this is what we did for years. We showed people the developments and the histories around South African art that we had, that the apartheid era broadcaster had failed to show the country.
Do you think your growing up queer made you like obviously more likely to like side on the black side of things when it came to apartheid?
Absolutely. There's no doubt that my queerness led me into a political space. I mean, I met at an early age in 1990 Simon Nkoli at the first Joburg Pride March organized by Nkoli and Bev Ditsi and Edwin Cameron. And as AIDS hit, when you grow up and sex is illegal, that's beautiful, fertile ground for disease to spread and viruses to grow and self-hatred and body shaming and all of the things attached to sex that are then you can't even talk about them. So the epidemic hit us hard, and Simon was, who himself passed away because of the virus, Simon was doing men's sexual health projects in Soweto across the East Rand. And I started documenting these on the TV show, and I started doing a series called Breaking the Silence, where it was still so stigmatized, and it was the queer men who were doing something about it and mobilizing and being visible about it.
So that's always just, but we look at history, it's always kind of been that way, that if you are oppressed, like you obviously have to fight back.
So it's the intersectionalities. I mean, Simon said it in that famous speech before the start of the first Pride, that I am black and I am gay, and please, those in the ANC want me to say I am black first, and those here in the movement of queers want to say I'm gay first, but I will never be either first. I'm all those things, and this is a key moment in our intersectionality studies, where we have to accept that there are multiple oppressions heaped upon black life, and Simon was a very, very big influence, and later Stephen Cohen would be. I was a terrible rebel, and I took a lot of drugs, and one of the people that really helped me out of that was the performance artist Stephen Cohen. I would go with him and help him with his work. I've actually encouraged him to drag for the first time. I remember one day I took him to Fort Klapperkop in Pretoria, where there was supposed to be an art exhibition there, but the RVB claimed the space for a centenary celebration of Paul Kruger's birth or death or something. And we literally marched all the way up to these guys with swastikas on their arm. This monster drag queen and this junky white faggot. This was not for sissies. I did tell the drag queen, look, this thing is going to be on the front page of the Sunday Times, and it was. Him confronting this face-to-face with a Nazi. These were real contestations, shopping malls where bombs were going off. The violence was everywhere, and the struggle for the art that resisted all of these oppressions was a real thing and a real endangering thing. Those artists made difficult work.
And nowadays we're facing a different problem in that it's those artists and that art has become commercialized. It's become marketable. It's become like, what big brands do essentially. And how do you feel about that? About queer culture actually coming into, like, Pride in the last month was just this massive thing that every brand was involved in, but it feels disingenuous and it feels like it's been co-opted.
I sat with Simon in the committee meetings of GLOW, who organised that march, and watched the white men, bankers, middle-class white men, slowly hijack Pride. They said it was for reasons of safety, that they took it further into the northern suburbs, which took it away from its historical site. I've just actually done a podcast for a French project on the importance of Hillbrow and the Skyline Bar, where we met and organised and met partners interracially. The march was co-opted. It got a VIP party, which meant that the poorest of the poor, the people who really mattered, had to take further money, that they were already spending more money on transport because it had been moved into the northern suburbs. And then it became this massive apartheid where white people would go to the VIP party and black people would braai on the lawns of Zulek, where we congregated. I never attended any of those marches in the north. And what happens when things become too commercialized? Everything is entropic. The rape and murder of lesbians meant that the 1 in 9 campaign, who had fought so hard around Kwezi, the woman we called Kwezi Fizeka, who had been allegedly raped by the former President Zuma, they demanded that the march not just celebrate, but also acknowledge the murder and rape of lesbians. And when the march wasn't willing to put it on the agenda in any meaningful way, they lay down in the road. and stopped the march. The result was some very, very angry lesbians who almost drove over them, and they got beaten by their own people. And that was the end of Joburg Pride, the oldest pride march on the continent. But what happened next was Kwezelomse Mbandisayo and Sigitlani Pamodi and a group of young queers began Joburg People's Pride, and they restored it to its original root in Hillbrow and put lesbians first. But before that bread, if we can't eat, we can't fuck.
Yeah, amen. Mm. So, yeah, culture becomes counterculture, becomes culture, becomes counterculture. I mean, you've probably seen that a million times. One thing I do want to ask, though, is how...
All popular, all pop, and I dare you to find examples that defy this. There might be some. All pop begins as counterculture, as opposite to the culture that is the mainstream culture. It's always a defiant thing. Kwaito might have become the pop of the liberation, but it was an underground Hillbrow form coming out of razzmatazz, coming out of townships. It was not something that was mainstreamed. It's only when the capital market sees that, oh, look, there's the pink rand, and oh, look at Hollywood now. It's a black endeavor, where now these capitalists are seeing how much money they can make out of black life. Yes, this is how culture operates. This is how pop culture forms, and the bubble pops, and a new one starts.
So, why pop culture, like as a whole, and why do you consider what you do, being a pop culture critic and not just an arts critic, or like what's the difference there?
Because I don't know that I am. I do a lot of different things. I primarily what I do is train young journalists. I've got a project.
That's what I want to get into next, yeah.
Project called Freedom for All that trains queer journalists in 13 countries. I run the training program at the newspaper because white people need to give back some of their privileges. And I love pop because while I greatly respect, so I started I became arts editor at the Mail and Guardian at a very young age. We were like children. And I created their Friday pull-out section for them. And I then later would create the trending pull-out section for City Press. And, I had to think very long and hard and use research, audience research, reader research, to try and help guide me as to who our reader was, so that we could take the reader with us instead of writing into the exclusivity that art so loves, and instead of preaching to the converted. I always wanted to, I put Brenda Fassie on the front cover of the first Friday, and it was called the Pop-Tart edition, which is really where I got my Twitter tag as a Pop-Tart. Because I believe that the more popular and mainstream a cultural work is, the more impact, negative or positive, it can have. And I would rather bring people to the party so that we can all see how important what potential roles culture and the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we grow up in, which are reflected in our art and our movies and our music, how important they are in shaping us.
So part of your mandate is to just get it out there to more and more people. And that's obviously why you are doing what you're doing with youngsters.
Well, all other art sections have died. The newspapers are shutting down their art sections furiously.
Why?
Because they're seen as not key revenue drivers of advertising, which is the traditional form of funding these print publications. The funding models are slowly shifting, but if you have managed to establish your cultural brand in your website or your print work or anywhere, it has equity, and the readers want it. And
we used to have magazines that were purely pop culture based, like they were like purely culture. Like I grew up on SL magazine, which is cover to cover, just a young person pop culture thing, and it's weird to like see that these days that exists online, I guess. So maybe that's where
that whole thing changed fundamentally because of the online space, and I don't see it as gone. I can read Bubblegum mag every day. It's there. It's online.
Shifted, but then again, I guess more people can even get it online. But as writers, like we don't get paid anywhere near as much as like.
And it's a terrible crisis. We don't know what to do. None of us know what to do here. Increasingly, the media is being funded by social justice money and human rights money and NGO fund. Huge swathes.
Is that good or bad?
It's good. Huge swathes of media are funded by Google and Facebook, which is not necessarily good. So it means that journalism needs to return to a more core purpose, which is human rights work. What its role really should be. It was a bubble when people were paying R1 million for a page for an advert, and I mean they were paying huge amounts of money.
But it's because that was the way they could reach people.
Mm-hmm. But it was a bubble in which journalism went off the rails, in my opinion. We have a very real duty to hold public funds accountable, to hold capitalist exploitation of art accountable, to introduce and to elevate work that might not get a platform otherwise. We have numerous duties that are based in human rights practice, not in commercial practice. So I am very comfortable with this funding because that's the kind of journalism that I do. And it's foundations like the other foundations that are paying for this queer desk we have at work where we can train young queer journalists. I'm very grateful to that money.
That's awesome. I mean, but wouldn't you worry about being agenda driven, at all, by these different, but I guess that it's your agenda that you are trying to also...
My experience of this funding has very, very much been, you're talking about things like the Daily Maverick, you're talking about things like Ground Up, like the Daily Box. These are all funded by the NGO sector. Okay. By places like the Open Society Foundation. I thought
the Daily Maverick might have been more private, but I had no idea.
No, not at all. Their funding comes from places like the Open Society Foundation and various other funds, as do many of the forums we have here at Durban. But my experience of this funding has been an incredible hands-off approach. I mean, if anyone is aware of the dangers of editorial interference, it is these funders. It's the commercial funders we need to be scared of, who have agendas, and suddenly you're doing an expose of a famous artist who's a rapist, and suddenly you get locked out of your story, or you want to expose MultiChoice capturing the SABC, and you're working for Naspers, who owns MultiChoice. I mean, fortunately, my editor is a great guy who let me do the work, and we had a terrible confrontation with MultiChoice over it. But
so that's happened. You're literally speaking from experience.
Yeah. Lloyd Getty and I did the series exposing Claudia Motseneng's SABC.
And City Press is owned partially by that.
Entirely by Naspers.
Okay.
We also own MultiChoice.
So you were basically
I was being a very bad boy, yeah. And this was a very important moment for me. There have been a few moments since I returned, because I then went away from print after working at the Mail and Guardian for a long time. I basically fucked out on drugs, and I had to rebuild my life after losing everything. My partner drowned in the ocean while swimming. My father died, and I came off the drugs, and I had to try and make amends and find my way back. And I started working in TV as a scriptwriter and working on those early user type things, Cha-Cha and things like that, until I used my drug experience to create a drama called Chissa, which I wrote and head wrote and co-produced with my company Moja Movie Factory. The big writer that taught me all of this stuff was a woman called Stephanie Pikova. I've always had these incredible women in my life who have mentored me.
How do you do so much?
I'm old, love. And we made big hit series. We did Mtunzini.com, set here in KZN, that was a murder mystery, but it was, being South African, it didn't have forensics. It had to be cultural tools that could solve the murders. And very difficult. It was like writing a murder mystery novel every week. Really hard work, that. And then we did
also a lot of cultural sensitivity involved with that.
Yeah, of course. You have we had a multiracial company and an entirely black cast and crew, and we had to really take a lot of. But because of the mandates of the SABC, it had to be in Zulu A. So even the Sotho speaking guys on the crew, or various language groups that were not Nguni, couldn't get the deep Zulu. So it wasn't just a white problem, but primarily it is a white problem, yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many cultural differences in South Africa, and if you're trying to...
And this is where culture can cut right through them.
Yeah, arts culture, or just... do you see a difference between culture and arts culture?
It doesn't matter. It is whatever you want it to be, and it can be a sex worker or a saint, I don't care. It has incredible power to impact on our lives and to help us find meaning and to find new paths. I triggered really hard when I went to see Oliver Hermanus' Skoonheid. I wasn't expecting the rape. I could not believe what was happening, but it was so well done. It was so logical that this terrible story would end there. So it's this queer film that would go on to win the Queer Prize in Cannes. I didn't go to bed that night because I had, when I was a junkie, been shot by the police and arrested and thrown in jail, and I had been held down and raped. And I hadn't told anyone this. And I was not able to live my full non-binary versatile self because I was too afraid of anal sex after that. And this process, what art can do, I teach a course called Between Trigger Alerts and Spoiler Alerts, where how do we handle sexual violence in cinema? Now that we're finally at a place where we acknowledge how powerful art can be in triggering. And it was a long journey that began there, and strangely, it would later I would come out about it when Zapiro reprised The Rape of Justice. It didn't trigger me the first time, but later when he did it again, I found myself sitting at my desk at work shaking and then just crying, like for a day. And then I wrote a thing on Facebook, and then a radio DJ, Kolani, picked it up, and it became quite a big story that I was saying to Zapiro, this is how powerful your art is, that it can do this to me. But I'm also saying it to Oliver Hermanus. I believe in the power of art.
But so you've, oh, wow, like I wasn't expecting you to be like, you know, Zapiro's art was powerful and it moved you in like that way. Like, because I would think triggering would typically be a negative, you know, like thing. And, you know, like trigger warnings are things that we have just like more and more people are going yes or no about them. Like,
but you see, a trigger warning is the choice.
But the thing is, with
your
something
right to choose.
with something like a Zapiro cartoon, Law of Skoonheid, you didn't even get the choice.
Look, I hate the Zapiro cartoon. I despise it because it's so creatively bankrupt that he can't find a better metaphor than Ray. And he does it with his cartoons of sports matches where you have buggery as the ultimate insult. Like if you really want to insult someone, you must bring the anal sex thing in.
So that's why I was just kind of surprised when you're saying that the Zapiro thing was powerful, but obviously that was in a negative way more than
look, there are things about Zapiro's work and his fight for free expression that I hugely support. And this is the important thing that one learns in critical thinking, is that we're allowed to like some of it and hate some of it. We're allowed to have a complex reaction to complex work. We're allowed to question parts but celebrate others. We're allowed to do this. This is in fact what we should be doing, because we live in this world of ridiculous binaries where Hollywood taught us there are Nazis and there are freedom fighters and they're good and they're bad, and there's nothing in between. We've lost the shade. This is why
it's becoming like that more and more. I'm finding myself like that, you know, being like, I'm good, they're bad, you know, like
I mean, this is why we get so scandalized when one of our role models does something bad, but we're all doing that bad thing. Or we get so outraged when somebody we thought was a good guy, it turns out to be just a human being. And we construct these realities, and art has a lot to do with it, that are binary. And it's nonsense.
It is.
I saw it in the opening night film here this year again in Jamil X.T. Koolbaker's film. It's, you've got the goodies versus the baddies, and
I felt a little let down in the film by it being a little shallow in that way. Like there were gray areas in it, but it wasn't necessarily like properly gray. Like you did have the good guy, and the bad guy was just someone who did bad things and just was driven by capitalism.
Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, Dudu, the good guy, is also a bad guy in that he sleeps with teenage girls.
But that's a whole other...
But that seems to be celebrated in the film, not a sign of badness. And the whole film suffers from a kind of toxic masculinity that I've written against, much to Jamil's displeasure, I'm sure, because I've frequently in the past supported.
But isn't that what he's exploring in these films? Like,
how is he exploring it? He's just simply presenting it.
Well, exactly.
There's no consequence for it. There's no turning points in the men in the film.
I've only seen good reports and people get away scot-free, so...
I'm not saying that we have to be morally policing and politically correct around the films, but where films are damaging to viewers, then viewers must know about it before they go and watch it. So if you're a woman who's been jackrolled, I would strongly recommend you don't go and watch Jamil's latest film, or for that matter, Back of the Moon, that was on the next night, which is equally toxic and violent in its, so we've got this absolute obsession with celebrating gangsters. I mean, a friend of mine, Wilfred, who was on the Talents Press program 2 years ago when I was teaching it, was WhatsApping me from Lagos, asking how Durban was, and I told him all the things about the gangster films, and he WhatsApped back, you guys do trauma like nobody else in the world. And this is very true. South African work is very violent, it's very hard, and this has to do with our brutal past.
I was going to say, isn't that just a reflection of the society we live in?
It is, but we also have a problem here with our film that I've just come from Lagos where I was doing the queer work for Freedom for All, and in South Africa we want to make the great South African film, and it takes 10, 12 years to do it because funding is so difficult to come by. We want these big budgets for our films, even though they're small budgets by comparison to Hollywood. So then when your film comes out 10 years later, it's 10 years old. Whereas in Lagos, the people are grabbing cameras like you're grabbing your podcast machine, and they're going to tell a quick, fast story that is within the zeitgeist. It comes out within a few weeks, and we keep moving until we establish our name to get a bigger and bigger budget, and we start doing something that isn't as Nollywoody.
One of the guys I was chatting to yesterday on the Creative Corner, Prof, who's the editor for Mbewa at the moment, he was just saying that's what, young creatives these days need to just do. Stop worrying about someone else, giving you a chance. Just go create stuff yourself, and eventually you'll get there.
Well, we have the tools of technology that have democratized the space. It's still privileged tools. Data is a human right, basically, but still there are people who don't have the data. So we have to always check our privilege. But yes, within the relative, art has this nasty habit of trying to increase its value by remaining exclusive and rare. And not letting people into the club, using special language to describe itself that outsiders don't understand. It's like they withheld the diamonds to increase their value. It's no different. It's a capitalist ploy.
Yeah.
And I'm very against this exclusionary practice, and I'm very opposed to these European forms like the art gallery that are in fact, while everything has its place and all things should be welcomed into the market, African art, you would imagine, would be a more public event, would be more market-related, and would be presented on the street. We need to decolonize the spaces if we want to find meaning in our history.
What does decolonization look like to you?
Decoloniality. I was the editor of the Fees Must Fall coverage at my newspaper, and I don't think it's really a white man who should be sitting here talking about it. But for me, what was very powerful inside the movement was not just the Fanon and the Biko and the intersectionality conversations, and the new language that we were gifted by these brilliant young students. It was in particular the Mbokodo movement, the women that stood up, and the queers with them, that demanded that the decoloniality include these freedoms for women and queers. That was very significant to me. The intergenerational war that has erupted, and we saw it in our own newsroom, was terribly important, because for the first time these patriarchs were shook. There were really a lot of the older men in the media were very opposed to what the students were doing. Some of them said, but we fought for these freedoms and won. What do these kids think they're doing? And I mean, it's just true that revolution is a wave, and things are entropic, and they must work in cycles, and each generation needs to... We can't just say we poured all this money into HIV/AIDS education.
No, it's done.
No, it's done, because the next kids are born without the knowledge. Every generation has to define the world for themselves.
And you're helping the next generation define the world with your mentorship programs and that. How do you find people to work with? How do you pick, young people?
A lot of people approach us. We put out ads. We work with the media.
But what are the qualities you're looking for in a young writer when you get their work, essentially, when you decide to work with them?
I think it's important that a writer is a writer is a writer. You need to be able to write a copy for a commercial, a film script, a opinion piece, a review, a feature, a investigative news piece, you're going to find you have better skills in some of these areas and you're more driven towards them. But I firmly believe as a writer, I need to master all formats of writing. And I do work across all of these formats. I've just written the Lebo Matosa series. I'm busy working on a film. I've published poetry. I've published plays. I've done investigative work. I write features. And this is, I'm not bragging. This is stuff that writers need to read, and read, so that they can observe the formats, so that they can know the rules, so that they can break them. What we're looking for, what you can't teach someone is how to write.
Really?
No, this is something that comes from your reading. So I'm looking for people who are meticulous, who have a strong work ethic, who are up for the challenge. Increasingly, I'm finding kids are switched off with their headphones on, disengaged from the world. This is the technological space we live in. I'm looking for people who are actively engaged in the world, who are willing to get off the internet, where the bulk of the journalism is being done now.
Yeah, you can't just Google.
To hit the street and to go for the challenge. One of my greatest success stories in this current training modules has been a young man called Pumlani Sitebelanga. And this is a guy who, if we're doing a sex edition, will make an appointment with John Matrix and write about it. This is a guy who will go out there and take the wunga for the cause. And this is the kind of journalism I did as a young man. I did this with drug stories on the cover of the newspaper often. That's why I got into sex work, was to write a feature about it. And this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for kids who have read, whatever their levels of privilege and access have been. But the internet is helping with that. And then the problem with these programs is that they tend to draw from the best of the best from the journal schools, and be focused particularly on the universities and the most expensive ones, and then take their top students. And this is a cunning ploy to bag the next generation and pay them very little at first, because interns get very minimal salaries. I don't work with unpaid interns. I'm not willing to do that work. It's exploitative. So the company has to provide, or the NGO funding, or whoever's funding the training. You have to be able to eat if you're going to write.
Yeah.
Same as fucking. You have to be able to eat first. So I'm really just looking for that tenacity, but that comes with solid ethics. There's a lot that you don't need to learn at school when it comes to journalism. There's a lot that you can only learn on the job.
That's what I've kind of picked up and seen just from most of the journalists I know, most of the people in journalism know, like, even like Peter and stuff, never studied it, never, got into journalism itself. It just became a calling over time because you want to tell the stories. Like, you're the people who are passionate about it.
I think it's important to learn to code. I think it's important to learn to use multimedia. I think it's important to learn podcasting. But none of these unless you have no access to the equipment, none of these are things that you necessarily need an institution for. You can teach yourself a lot of stuff, but an institution can be very, very valuable in shaping your critical thinking, your discourse with your fellow students, placing you in an adult world. There's a lot of positives. I'm not dissing the academy at all.
You literally, you lecture. Right?
I do teach, yeah.
Yeah. So how could you, dismiss them? They have their own value, though. Obviously, universities have their own value. These different courses have their own value. But at the end of the day,
I was just a little annoyed that the internship programs within my workspace were targeting these brilliant children, and that's great. They must be targeted. It's just not. Pumlani I brought in. He was the first person that I brought into that program who didn't have a degree. Imagine that. That these upliftment projects and training projects are only for the people with the most access.
Yeah, that makes absolutely no sense, because at the end, that's the biggest issue I think we have in this country, is getting brilliant people, who can't get into university, who don't have those opportunities to ever even apply for funding for those things.
So we do take people who walk in off the street. I mean, I did it when I was a young journalist. I walked in off the street.
But even these days, does it still happen?
I get DMs. And the kids come through. Some come through for a few weeks. Some stay for a few months, depending what funding's available. We do unpaid internships when it's those 1 week ones that you have to do to complete your studies.
School,
yeah, then that's something that the students factor into their expenses.
Cool. I think that actually brings us to the end because you did give me way more time than I asked for. So
Oh, I
thank
hope
you.
I don't miss my flight.
You won't. You're
Okay.
going to, like, we're 10 minutes over. So thank you so much, Charl. I'm going to leave you to carry on packing, and I'm going to unpack this with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.